You are listening to the Wyn Thomas File.
And time for another guest on the Wyn Thomas File. That is Greg Lewis and his book, The Nazi Ghost Train. Thanks for your company today.
Thanks for having me, Wyn.
Can we look at some of the characters in the book? So one that pops up is Lieutenant John Bud Brown. Can you tell me about him, please?
John Bud Brown is one of the sort of a dozen or so, maybe more, airmen are in the book. He's an American bomber pilot, and he's particularly interesting because he took off on a mission knowing that half of his regular crew had gone down with food poisoning. And these young men who were flying these missions were obviously superstitious. They were facing death every day. So something like that was to him a bad omen. And unfortunately, it turned out to be a bad situation because he was shot down on that mission. And he becomes one of the airmen that then are on the run in occupied Belgium during World War II and looking for the help of resistance and invasion line people to keep them free. And Bud teams up with another fighter pilot called Bill Grosvenor, who just about escaped with his life and actually has to go on the run with him, and they're in extremely dangerous situations. And what happens is that many of these airmen were betrayed, and many of them were betrayed by a man called Prosper de Zitter, whose story is told sort of extensively in this book, because he really is one of the most despicable double agents of the Second World War.
Yeah, I think they meet up very early in the book with Françoise Laborne, don't they? She was a spy, was she? Yes,
well, they meet up with a number. Essentially, what you have in a situation in Belgium is if you want to stay free, you don't want to be captured. It's very hard to do it on your own. So you have to have people who are going to help you, and they've been sort of briefed about, invasion lines and people who might be helpful. And many of these were women. Many of the couriers in particular for the invasion lines were women, very, very brave people, constantly risking death. And there are a number of those who helped John Brown and other people.
Yeah, and then sorry, the Comet line, was that successful in getting people home?
The Comet Line, yes. The Comet Line was very successful for a long period of time. Essentially, what it was a series of couriers and safe houses which ran from Brussels all the way through France down to sort of the Bayonne area, and then across the Pyrenees into Spain. And it was run by a lady called André de Jong for the first part of the war. And the Comet Line sort of tells a story of Asian lines in many ways, because it was a story of betrayal as well, because they were running extremely high risks. In the end, André de Jong, she was captured and sent to a concentration camp. Many of the people in my book are working just after that time, so they're still keeping airmen alive. But after D-Day, they stopped taking people down through France to Spain because there was too much danger, really, with the fighting and the supply of German tanks and soldiers going to Normandy. So then they had to try and keep people in Belgium, which has obviously had its own dangers as well, because they were under constant sort of risk of capture by the Gestapo or the German military intelligence, the Abwehr, which were very keen to break these evasion lines.
And talking about the Germans, I was quite intrigued. There was a counter-espionage movement by the Germans. Were they all posing as shot-down pilots?
Indeed, yes, and it's a great piece of research to be done, really, as to just how successful this sort of subterfuge was. They certainly took over a line which is very much associated with the Netherlands and Belgium, and the sort of the double agent that I'm talking about, de Zitter, ran his own line as well. So airmen thought they were in the hands of good Belgian patriots, but sometimes they turned out not to be. And people like Prosper de Zitter were making an awful lot of money handing over airmen to German military intelligence. And before that, he had done it with soldiers, with Jews, and with many members of the Belgian resistance.
Wow. What a despicable man, as you said. But But it must have been a bit disheartening, was it? Where they passed through so many hands, they passed through different people all the time, did they? Did that got them down in the end? Think, where am I going? How am I going to get home?
I think they went through a lot of different emotions, because obviously I've read a lot of, I've met a lot of airmen actually, including evaders who were shot down. So the first thing is, of course, most of them, when they came out of their aircraft, they'd never parachuted before, that they weren't parachutists. So they jumped out of their burning aircraft, they land on the ground. The first thing is, well, great, I'm still alive. That's the first emotion they're gonna feel, and then they're gonna feel, well, now I'm behind enemy lines. I'm not going home tonight. What's going to happen to me? So they know that they've got to find help if they want to stay free. So I think every airman that I've met who was involved with the evasion lines has just complete respect for these people. They think they're the real heroes because those are the people that were really risking their lives. So I think it could have been boring at times, because they were left in safe houses. Some of the people in my book are there for 7, 8, 9 months, just in hiding. They were supplied with black market food. Very often people would bring them English language books. They were really well looked after by a whole chain of people. For every airman that went on the run, there were probably dozens of people involved in some way in trying to help them, getting them civilian clothes, false papers, and moving them from safe house to safe house.
Wow, incredible stuff indeed. Yeah. Let's go back to one of the characters there you mentioned, which is Bill Grosvenor. What was he? Was he a pilot?
Yes, he was a fighter pilot, and Bill Grosvenor, very interesting character. In actual fact, he took part in a documentary about 20 years ago, where he went back to Belgium to meet some of the people who helped him. He was very, very fortunate to escape his aircraft. He was flying a Mustang, which was involved in basically low-level strafing of targets like trains and other things like that. And he was coming in very, very low, and he hit some telephone wires, managed to very, very quickly gain height, just enough to eject. And then when he came down, there were a lot of people around, because he was flying in the daytime, as a lot of Americans were. They were flying daytime missions. So a lot of people were quickly gathering around him. And he very fortunately quite quickly found somebody who would help him. He was taken to Brussels. He was found papers and clothes so he could survive for a little while. But when he was captured, Bill went through a very terrible series of tortures, really, in what were called the dark cells of the Saint-Gilles prison in Brussels. So he was locked up in this very small cell with no window, very little food, just a bucket, really, hardly room to lie down. And they pumped in kind of recordings or talks saying that he had betrayed other people. So he was constantly tortured by this idea that he had betrayed people. Airmen often felt when they were interrogated that they hadn't said anything, but they had this kind of guilt that they had just given something away, whatever it was. And they played on his mind very much with that. So Bill really went through an awful time in Saint-Gilles prison.
Yeah, Saint-Gilles sounded like a real horrible place to be, wasn't it? It was more like an old dungeon, wasn't it, than a proper prison, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, and in fact, it's still there now as a prison. It was a proper prison. It looked very much, I suppose, it's got an imposing look to it. Big stonework, rather bigger than Swansea Prison or Cardiff Prison, with these kind of like towers, which are like a fort, give a fortress feel to them. But basically, during the occupation, it became a prison for German patriots. The Hotel of Patriots is what the Belgians call it, because it was really a lot of resistance workers, their families, Jews, airmen who'd been captured. So the prison became a military prison, in a sense, for Germany's military enemies.
Yeah. they obviously had a change in the civvy clause, but civvy clause became a thing. The Germans' attitude towards them changed, didn't it? Because obviously they'd normally be in uniform, but they weren't in uniform anymore. So was that a different thing? They might think they were spies and not shot down airmen?
It's a good point. Where it was a massive risk, because in order to evade, as in, i.e., stay free, you really couldn't stay in your uniform. So one of the first things that every airman who was shot down was given was some civilian clothes. They would keep their dog tags on, so they were identified as a serviceman. But particularly in this period that I'm writing about, which is mainly 1944. After the events, for instance, we know about the Great Escape, where 50 airmen were shot after they escaped from the prison camp, as depicted in the film, with Steve McQueen. So in that period, after that, it did become more dangerous to be an airman who was shot down, because you weren't entirely protected by the fact that you had been you were a serviceman and not a spy. So, for instance, if you were involved in any resistance activity, or even a suspicion of resistance activity if you were arrested, you were in danger of being sent not to a prison camp, but a concentration camp. And that did happen with some airmen. Some airmen ended up in Buchenwald, for instance, and the airmen in my book were all going to end up in Neuengamme, which is a concentration camp in northern Germany, and their chances of coming home from there would have been small.
Yeah, those dog tags in one occasion did give them away, didn't it? They thought they were civilians, but they weren't. Somebody still had their dog tags on, didn't they?
Yes, of course. Keeping your dog tags on, it was a double-edged sword, really. You kept them on to show that you weren't a spy, that you were a shot-down airman. But yes, there's a group of airmen in my book who were being brought down to the Ardennes forest they set up camps there, the resistance, to keep them hidden. They were on their way down. Of course, they were stopped at a checkpoint, and just slowly pulled away one of their jackets and shirts and saw the dog tags, and of course, the game was up. And there's another airman who a lot of the American pilots were Jewish, so they were running an extra risk, And there's a guy called Ted Kleinman in my book who ran two risks really. He was a Jewish person from the Bronx in New York, and when he was captured, he had his dog tags, of course, and on his dog tag it had the letter H, signifying that he was Jewish, and he'd also been working with the resistance. So he was fortunate. He was captured very, very late on. The interrogation was not very in depth, but if they had found out that he was Jewish and been working with the resistance, that he would have been in danger of summary execution, which wasn't usual in France and Belgium, but did happen to airmen in Poland and Germany.
So you mentioned that concentration camp. Whose idea was it to send all these airmen to the concentration camp to clear out the prison?
Well, this is essentially there had been deportations going on throughout the occupation in Belgium, and during 1944, an SS general called Young Klaus took over, and he accelerated the deportations during the summer of 1944. And even though the British Army were, knocking at the gates really of Brussels, he still wanted to go ahead with this deportation of these enemies of the Reich, as he called them, the resistance people, their families, the airmen, SOE agents that were in Saint-Gilles. So in some ways, it was part. This part of the Germans' kind of failure really was this continuation to have revenge on their enemies when they should have been concentrated more on their military aspect of defending the city. Young Klaus was driving that home, and they took 200 prisoners out of Saint-Gilles on one particular day, and then they were ready to clear out the rest of the prison, 1,400, on the next day. And of course, that did alert the people of Brussels as to what was going on.
Yeah, and of course that is because the form of the nasty ghost train as well, isn't it? Yeah, indeed. Yeah. I mean, what you talk about there is about pilots and airmen being sent to concentration camps. Maybe it's a little bit of a known fact that you've discovered there, opened up there, because a lot of people talk about Stalag 10 and Stalag this and Stalag that, and I think they were all there having a good little time just being prisoners, but it didn't always happen like that, did it? They were being sent to concentration camps as well as being in normal prison camps.
Yes, it was unusual, but particularly in that period after D-Day, in that last sort of year of the war, it did happen. A number ended up in Buchenwald, as I said, but they were later moved on to Stalag Luft 3, which is actually where the Great Escape took place. It's modern-day Poland. There are stories of airmen being killed by civilians in Germany. You can imagine. There was a lot of anger, amongst the German population, particularly towards bomber crew. If you came out of your plane very close to where you'd been bombing, there was a danger from civilians. There was anger against the Luftwaffe here as well. So it's sort of understandable. So particularly in that last year of the war, being an airman shot down did become extremely dangerous thing to happen. There are stories in that I've uncovered of German soldiers protecting airmen against the civilian population, because obviously the sort of Nazi propagandists called the airmen terrorists and child killers, baby killers. So that kind of whipped up a lot of hatred as well. And of course, Germany was being very, very heavily bombed.
Yeah. But it's a fascinating story. Absolutely incredible, detailed stuff you've done there. Some incredible research as well, and it's well worth a read. All I can say is thank you very much for spending the time today and being my guest on the Wyn Thomas File.
Thank you very much for having me, Wyn, and I'm glad you enjoyed the book.
Thank you.